Welcome to Middle East Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: U.S. accused of being complicit in war crimes after vetoing Gaza vote. The status quo is smashed. The future is messy and dangerous. Putin thanks Egypt's Sisi for Gaza help in call on eve of election. Live updates: Israel strikes North and South Gaza after U.S. vetoes a UN ceasefire resolution. Turkey's Erdogan accuses the West of barbarism and Islamophobia in the war in Gaza. U.S. accused of being complicit in war crimes after vetoing Gaza vote. The Independent. The U.S. has been accused of complicity in war crimes in Gaza by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas after vetoing a UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas conflict. The move has been criticized by capitals across the Middle East as well as human rights groups. The U.S. justified its position, stating that a ceasefire will only plant the seeds for the next war and that it supports humanitarian pauses. The death toll in Gaza now stands at well over 1,700, according to the health ministry. The status quo is smashed. The future is messy and dangerous. BBC. The conflict between Israel and Hamas has shattered the old status quo and has forced leaders and citizens to consider different options for the future. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan for the day after the war is unclear, with opponents claiming his only plan is to stay in power and avoid conviction on corruption charges. Netanyahu has rejected foreign peacekeepers and dismissed U.S. President Joe Biden's plan to replace Hamas with the Palestinian Authority. Biden wants to revive the two-state solution and has sent considerable support to Israel, but Israel's settlement movement sees the conflict as an opportunity to expand Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinian leaders believe Israel's goal is ethnically cleansing Gaza and eventually annexing the West Bank. There are concerns that the conflict will not end neatly, and Israel may struggle to achieve the crushing victory promised by Netanyahu. Putin thanks Egypt's Sisi for Gaza help in call on eve of election. Reuters. Russian President Vladimir Putin discussed the situation in Gaza with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in a phone call. Putin thanked Sisi for his help in evacuating Russian citizens from Gaza and getting humanitarian aid into the war zone. Putin has previously blamed the war on the failure of U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East and aims to position Russia as an important player in the region. Live updates: Israel strikes North and South Gaza after U.S. vetoes a UN ceasefire resolution. Associated Press. Israel has continued to carry out airstrikes and artillery attacks in the Gaza Strip, despite a UN resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. The U.S. vetoed the resolution, arguing that halting military action would allow Hamas to continue ruling Gaza and would lead to future conflict. The war between Israel and Hamas was triggered by Hamas' attack on southern Israel, in which militants killed over 1,200 people and took hostages. The death toll in Gaza has now surpassed 17,400 over the past 2 months, with the majority being civilians. In the West Bank, Israeli forces killed 2 Palestinians on Saturday, bringing the total number of Palestinians killed since the start of the conflict to 274. Turkey's Erdogan accuses the West of barbarism and Islamophobia in the war in Gaza. Associated Press. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has used a speech on human rights to accuse the West of barbarism for its stance on the Israel-Hamas war and what he alleged was its toleration of Islamophobia. Erdogan called Israel's actions in Gaza atrocities and massacres that will shame the whole of humanity and criticized international institutions and human rights organizations for not taking concrete steps to prevent violations of human rights. Erdogan also referred to the U.S. veto of a UN resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, saying that a fairer world was not possible with America. He also defined Islamophobia and xenophobia as the greatest threats to human rights. IDF Special Forces raid to rescue Hamas hostages in Gaza fails, say Israel media reports. Yahoo! 2 Israeli soldiers have been severely wounded in a failed hostage rescue operation in Gaza. The raid on a Hamas compound was intended to free hostages taken in a raid on southern Israel on October 7. The mission eliminated Hamas militants but was unsuccessful in freeing the hostages. Hamas claims to have thwarted the operation. Teenager killed, 15 detained in Israeli raids in occupied West Bank. Al Jazeera. Israeli forces carried out multiple raids in the occupied West Bank on Saturday, as heavy fighting continued across the Gaza Strip. Israeli military jets pounded parts of North, Central, and South Gaza. The number of Palestinian arrests mounts every day, with more than 3,600 people being arrested since the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began on October 7. The UN has said about 80% of the population has been displaced in Gaza, with dire shortages of food, fuel, water and medicine reported. Gaza at high risk of famine as fatalities surge amid apocalyptic conditions. South China Morning Post. Aid charities have warned of an apocalyptic situation in Gaza, following 2 months of war between Israel and Hamas. The UN has warned of deteriorating health and food conditions, and a breakdown of public order if a ceasefire is not secured. The World Food Programme has said the risk of famine is high, and the World Health Organization has warned that civilization is collapsing in Gaza. Gaza war unleashes anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim sentiment in the U.S. Al Jazeera. Muslim Americans and Arab Americans are facing consequences for expressing their opinions on the Israel-Palestine conflict, including loss of jobs and suspension from college. Universities in the U.S. are also cracking down on student activism. The Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, has received double the usual amount of reports of bias and requests for help since the beginning of Israel's war on Gaza. Nihed Awad, the executive director of CAIR, warns that as the Israeli narrative falls apart, more attempts to dehumanize Palestinians will be seen. Once, this was Iraqi farmland. Now it's controlled by an Iran-linked militia. New York Times. The area of Jerf al-Nasser, just south of Baghdad, is controlled by an Iraqi militia linked to Iran and designated a terrorist group by the United States. The militia, Kataib Hezbollah, uses the area to assemble drones and retrofit rockets, with parts largely obtained from Iran. These weapons are then distributed for use in attacks by Iranian-linked groups across the Middle East. This has raised fears that the conflict in Gaza could escalate into a wider conflict. Well, folks, it seems like the situation in Gaza is getting messier and more dangerous by the day. The U.S. has been accused of complicity in war crimes after vetoing a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, the conflict has shattered the old status quo and leaders are scrambling to figure out what comes next. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan for the future is unclear, and there are concerns that the conflict will not end neatly. Russian President Vladimir Putin has discussed the situation with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, thanking him for his help in evacuating Russian citizens and providing humanitarian aid. And Turkey's President Erdogan has accused the West of barbarism and Islamophobia, criticizing the U.S. veto and calling for a fairer world. In the midst of all this, a failed hostage rescue operation in Gaza has left 2 Israeli soldiers severely wounded, and Israeli forces continue to carry out raids in the occupied West Bank. The situation in Gaza is becoming increasingly dire, with aid charities warning of an apocalyptic situation and the risk of famine. And closer to home, Muslim and Arab Americans are facing consequences for expressing their opinions on the conflict, with reports of bias and requests for help doubling. All of this just goes to show that the conflict in Gaza has far-reaching consequences and is affecting people and countries around the world. It's a complex and volatile situation, with no easy solutions. But one thing is clear, the status quo is smashed, and the future is messy and dangerous. As always, I encourage you, my dear viewers, to share your thoughts and questions. What do you make of all this? Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.